please show some love for Scott.
I'm waking up to ash and dust. I wipe my brow and I sweat my rust.
Well, good morning. How's everybody feeling? Did we go out last night? I think some of you did because I was watching the number game and some of you were throwing the numbers in just kind of like this glazed look over your eyes. Little worried about the math skills today. Well, it's good to be here with you guys this morning. So I want to talk to you about a topic that has been really hot in the entrepreneur scene for about the past 10 years. It really sort of peaked in 2011, and it's this idea of grit, right? So it was Angela Duckworth came out with a story talking about how she had come from the world of consulting and became a teacher. And so she said as she was there working with her students, she was looking at their grades and learning about how they were doing, and basically finding that the most intelligent kids were not always the kids getting the best grades. And she started thinking about what is that? What is the trend? What is the best predictor of success in academia? And how she characterized it was this trait called grit. So just to kind of get a read on the room, how many people in the past couple of years have read a blog post, heard someone discuss, heard a podcast? Anybody talking about grit? Anybody? Okay, that's what I thought. Okay. So the concept is great, right? And it's something that we need to understand because sometimes we overweight the importance of talent. We overweight the importance of, sort of innate skill or innate ability, and we think that if we have that or if we don't have that, that's going to determine what we can do. And so sometimes the really talented people don't put in the effort, and so they're not successful. And sometimes the people who don't feel talented just think they can't ever be successful, so they never put in the effort either. But the thing that I've started realizing, because again, this really got popular in 2011, right when we were starting PeerFit. And so I was reading about this and thinking about this, and I had a lot of friends in the entrepreneurial community in Gainesville. We were at UF at the time. And I saw people who really glamorized grit, and it was all about grit. And I'm working so hard, and they're posting these status updates about like another all-nighter. I'm going to be a successful entrepreneur. I'm putting in 24-hour days. And that clearly, there's a problem there, right? Because just working hard and just having grit by itself isn't the whole story. So really what I want to talk to you about today is kind of filling in the gaps. A little bit more of unpacking what grit means and how it can be effective in your life and how you can save some friction and some frustration in your life by dialing it down a little bit and making sure you understand the nuances there. One of the ways I want to think about how grit isn't enough in isolation is this idea and this quote here. And I'm not trying to poo-poo Angela here because I think this is an amazing and important topic, right? Grit is something that we need to understand. We need to be willing to put in the time and willing to put in the effort. But she says grit is living life like it's a marathon and not a sprint. Absolutely. Pacing yourself, right? That's sort of that idea. Live like you're going to continue to be pushing and pressing on this for a long time. However, if any of you guys have been starting your own companies already and doing this for a little while, you know that entrepreneurship is kind of like going from crisis to crisis a lot of times. And in that world, it's really hard to think of it like a sprint, or to think of it like a marathon. It feels a lot more like sprint after sprint after sprint, after storm after storm after storm. And to kind of characterize this a little bit, so he mentioned I'm a professional musician, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But actually, before I started PeerFit, so in 2010, I was actually living on a sailboat with two old British guys. I won't tell the backstory of how I got there, but I was living on a sailboat with two old British guys in the North Sea. And at this point, I had been there for about a week. And the weather had been with us, pretty nice weather. It was early spring in the UK, so it's, cold. But I was out in the water, and we had been, enjoying it, working drills. I was getting some sailing certifications while I was out there. But this particular day, a storm had blown up overnight. And so when we woke up to this and discovered this has kind of been at our doorstep, we had to hightail it back in to protected waters because it was coming straight for us. And so we were going to be sailing up towards the River Thames, this river that runs 40 miles from the east of England into London. And unfortunately, we only had an hour because the tide was about to turn against us, literally. Because in England, and this is something I learned because I grew up sailing in Florida, where the tide is maybe 3 or 5 feet between high tide and low tide. And so between high tide and low tide, there's a little bit of a current that comes in and out. In England, the tide is sometimes 30 to 50 feet between high tide and low tide. And what that means is when the tide is changing, that the current of the water can literally push you backwards even though you're sailing forwards. So we really needed to hurry to get in to shore. And the wind was also blowing against us as well. So just to give you a picture here. So I was coming from Florida. I learned to sail at USF St. Pete, if you got any bulls in the room. But I would take the boats out in between classes, and it was gorgeous, right? I mean, we would literally see dolphins swimming alongside the boat. I mean, we would take, maybe some lady friends, go grab a couple beers, go out on the boat, and enjoy Tampa Bay. Cut to, I am now sitting on a boat with 2 old stinky British guys who cuss a lot, and I'm in full rain gear, and it's pouring rain, and I'm literally tied into the boat. That was a new experience, because when you're sailing in that kind of storm, you literally have to be tied into the boat so you don't fall out. Recently, when I was there, someone had fallen into the water in the River Thames and had been rescued eventually, but not before they froze to an anchor. So we were really putting a lot of emphasis on not falling out of the boat. It looks something like this. This is not a picture from there, but this is sort of what it looked like. We had a 3-man crew, and we basically had to get our way up there. And we had an experienced captain, Captain Dave, which doesn't sound like a great captain name, but it is. He's got like the full, tan skin, weather-beaten, the big mat of hair, like everything you'd want from a captain. And so we are basically working our way up the wind to get to protected waters. And I won't go into detail because I want to cut some time off the talk this morning, but that is a stressful situation. It's hard to get into that situation and think, I'm running a marathon. I'm going to pace myself and have grit and take care of all of this. I'm just thinking, don't fall out of the boat. Like, don't die, Scott. And see, what happens is when the storm is that big, when you have 40-knot winds, which we had at that time, and that hits these foresails, the pressure that puts on the lines of the boat is tremendous. So there's about 2,000 pounds of pressure on the sheets connecting the sails to the blocks, where you actually trim the sails and get power. And so what would happen is when we were tacking, you have to keep changing direction, right? You can't go directly into the wind. You have to kind of keep going a little bit off course, a little bit off course, a little bit off course, and work your way up. And so every time we would change direction, the captain would just yell, tack! And you basically had 4 seconds to either loosen your line and let him take it in on the other side, or have it come back over to you, and then you had to wrap the cable, put it in the block, put the sheet in the block, and have it secured in time before the boat went too far the other way, and all of a sudden you were, upside down. And the boat was heeling so much at this point. I mean, when I look to the side of the boat, I'm sitting here on the starboard side in the cockpit. When I look to the right, I wasn't looking out over open ocean. I was literally looking down into the water as it was coming over the side of the boat. That's how much the boat was heeling. And so we did this basically at 3-minute increments. So we would go 3 minutes one way, 3 minutes the next way, 3 minutes one way, 3 minutes the next way. And every single time leading up to it, I'm getting this worked up feeling because I know I've got 4 seconds. I got to get that put into the block. And so I'm doing this thing where I got to wrap it, and I'm like, every single muscle in my body is just as tense as possible. My pinky toes are cramping somehow, And we finally get there, right? We finally get up through the waves, through the weather, to protected water. The wind starts to die down. We're able to make our way to the anchorage. And I just sort of unceremoniously kind of sprawl onto the cockpit, just panting, and guys, we did it, The captain goes below deck. I was sure, just to pass out as well because we were all exhausted, and I was the youngest one there. However, he comes up, and I never forget this, and just this very chipper voice says, all right, brilliant, who wants to spot T? And I just kind of hated him at that moment, right? But so this was the idea that we sailed through the same storm, but we had 2 very, very different experiences of it. And so this is what I want to kind of start to unpack with you is the idea of grit and how you apply grit and how to be more judicious with the grit you apply. So again, in the past 10 years or so, the idea of grit has been really popularized, been really emphasized, sort of in isolation. And again, I've been hearing stories from entrepreneurs talking about how hard they're working, how much they're powering through and driving themselves towards their goals. But just to kind of illustrate what this looks like, I want to introduce you to somebody with a lot of grit YouTube thankfully captured this video, or got this video from security footage at a late night establishment, a bar, where this gentleman decided he wanted to get in after hours. And so he's going in the back door of this bar. He may have been intoxicated at the time, we cannot verify. But basically what happens, if you've ever seen the video, he walks up to the door and just tries to push right in. Doesn't open. Okay, but this guy's got grit, so he's not giving up, right? So he turns around, you see him back up from the camera and just does this big, kick in the door. And it's this big glass door. Nothing happens. But he's not giving up. He's gritty. And so the next, he looks around him, looking for his resources, right? Maybe we call this a pivot in the entrepreneurial community. He decides to grab a keg. And so you kind of see him waddle over with the keg. He kind of winds back and just chucks it into the door. And the first time, it actually makes a little crack, right? Get a little fracture into the door. And so he picks it up again. Now he's feeling good, right? I'm making traction. I'm going to iterate, right? So gritty, throws it again, does this one more time, and finally now he's put a hole into the door. Not a big hole, but he's put a hole into the door. And so then he proceeds to start getting into the door, sort of. And so walking his leg through, he's kind of pushing himself through, being, tough, saying, he is committed, right? He's getting into this bar. Then does this sort of acrobatic move where he's falling in through the hole, kind of like being birthed into the world. Gritty, right? This guy's got grit. However, at the next part, as he sort of falls there onto the floor, his leg kind of just pushes lightly against the door from the opposite direction, and suddenly the door just flies open because it was a pull door the entire time, and my man didn't test that theory out. But you see where I'm going with this, right? Because just because you can be really gritty and get to the same end goal, you might want to think about if there's an easier way. Right? So here's the idea. Here's the chicken soup for the soul to take away. You can break through barriers by banging your head against a wall, but check the door first anyway. Right? And what I want to talk to you again this morning about is kind of looking for those ways of saving yourself effort, not putting so much emphasis on grit that you neglect the fact that there might be an easier path. So here's a new perspective on grit, and I think this solves a lot of problems in itself, because when you just think of grit as this sort of single thing, where it's like you either have grit or you don't grit, and you either have a lot of grit or you don't have much grit. Even Angela Duckworth, actually, in her talks would say, I'm not sure how you develop grit, but I know it's important. So I want to propose that there is a way to develop grit and kind of where it comes from. And the first thing we need to do is separate out the idea of potential grit from the idea of applied grit. So your potential grit, your ability to work hard and overcome adversity in your personal life, in your professional life, for your company, for anything, comes from your own conviction and your values. If you do not have conviction in your values, you will never be gritty. There has to be something in your life that you are passionate about and convicted about. So on the boat, the personal value that I had a lot of conviction about was not dying, which I think is one we can all share, right? So I had a lot of grit. I had a lot of determination I could draw on from like a well, right? I could draw on this well of like, I've got to do this, I've got to survive. So on the most fundamental level, we all can relate to that. But whatever else in your life that it is, whatever it is you value, whether that's things like self-reliance, or maybe you had someone in your family who lost the battle to cancer, and so now you're really passionate about it. You have a value to help stop and end cancer for the world. Whatever that is, your convictions in your values will determine how much potential grit you can draw on in your life. But we need to distinguish that, because having grit potential is not the same thing as applying grit and being gritty and working hard. Because see, what happens is where the rubber actually meets the road is all of your assumptions. So if your grit potential is your conviction and your values, your applied grit in your life is based on your confidence in your assumptions. You make assumptions that you think live up to your values. I will fulfill my value if I do X, Y, and Z. And so in as much as you have confidence in those assumptions, you can use the grit potential in your life and work really, really hard. right? So this guy's wanting to get into the bar. He has a value that he really wants to get a drink, right? And so he's drawing on this well of like, I am getting my drink, right? So his assumptions, where his grit actually took application was that he could push that door open, that he could break that door down. And so that's the assumption he worked from. And that's where he kept drawing grit from. I've got to break this door down, because all of a sudden he had inextricably linked the thought of I need to get a drink with I need to break this door down, right? So when you're starting companies and when you're trying to do anything in your life, if you only connect the idea, if you can't see the distinction between I want this outcome and this is the way I assume right now I have to get that outcome, you might end up crawling through a glass door only to find out that it opens from the inside. So a new perspective on grit, deliberate assumptions. So when you think about this, in your life, everything that's determining how hard you're working, how much stress, how much strain, how much muscle you're using in life is based on your assumptions and how they connect to your values. And you can divide those assumptions into two categories. There's deliberate assumptions, where you are consciously making a choice, very scientifically thinking about, if I do this, I will get this outcome. If I build my business this way, if we go after this customer segment, or if I market this way, I will get this outcome. And I'll unpack a little bit more, because there's a lot of fantastic tools and fantastic literature for entrepreneurs to read about how to test your assumptions, how to make better assumptions when they're deliberate, when they're consciously chosen. But what I want to talk more about is this idea of instinctual assumptions. Because for the vast majority of us, there are things in our lives that we are driven by, and we strive, and we work hard, and we worry, and we are concerned, and we strain, and we don't even really know why. But we have these assumptions. We have these unconscious assumptions in our lives that drive those things. And I'll unpack those as well. But here's the idea. The more grit you expend on wrong assumptions, the less likely you are to succeed, or worse, to even enjoy the journey. Because being an entrepreneur is tough, any way you slice it. Grit, no grit, being smart about your grit, anything. It is tough. And so there's two ways to get, more of that outcome. You either can try to build up your convictions, and I highly encourage that. I think that should be a daily activity. Scan your life, know your values, and invest in those. Nurture those values, and that will develop your potential grit. But if you want to have more grit to apply to succeeding, you need to scan your life as well for wasted effort. And that can be wasted effort in terms of the time you're spending, in terms of the money you're spending, also in terms of just the strain and the stress. Because if you have incorrect assumptions in your life, you worry about those assumptions, right? And we'll talk more specifically about some of those. So again, with deliberate assumptions, the idea is that they're consciously chosen. You think about these things, you pick these things, you kind of do market research, let's say, to try to figure out what assumptions you need to make about your customer, what assumptions you need to make about your vendors. And you go with that, and you test and assess, and you change. So there's a fantastic book. If you haven't read this, you need to. The Lean Startup by Eric Ries. And it basically looks at Toyota as this kind of template, where they went to small batch design, where they, rather than sort of putting in tons of work, tons of grit, into building a single car based on a single design, they started doing these iterative batch testings, right? So before you start investing all of your investors' money or your personal money into building a full-fledged product, the idea is building a minimum viable product, building something that you can test and get feedback on so that you don't waste effort. So I don't want to talk too much on that because there's already a lot of literature there. But instinctual assumptions is something I've not heard too much about. And it's the idea that these assumptions we just sort of make instinctively. We're really completely unaware of them for a large part of the time. But to get better at this, so the idea is, and really this is something that's been popular now in the wellness community, so I haven't talked much about PeerFit, the idea that if you're going to make people healthier, mindfulness is a big part of that. And mindfulness really preaches, if anybody has ever tried this with meditation, is about scanning your body for stress, scanning your body for tension, being mindful of your body. And so what I'm suggesting is that for you to get that same principle in your life for these unconscious assumptions, where you might find wasted effort and wasted work in your life, you need to do the same thing. So the skill set you want to develop is the ability to scan your environment, to scan yourself and look for wasted effort, to look for strain. Unconscious assumptions feel like tension. That's one of the ways you can find them. And here's the thing to hold on to. The accuracy of your assumptions and your conviction and your values will determine if you're successful, not just your grit. Let's just get that on the table. We need to have both. You need to have grit, absolutely, but if you're not questioning your assumptions, you might spend a lot of time. That guy might never have gotten into the bar, right? Some entrepreneurs never succeed. In fact, the majority do not, right? And this is part of it, because if you're only thinking hard work and not thinking, am I making the right assumptions? Am I working hard on the right things? Okay, so now let's unpack this a little bit more. I'm guessing you probably know the two people in the middle, right? On the left, the guy on the left. Anybody? Keegan-Michael Key? Right? Okay, anybody know, this is bonus points. Anybody know the gentleman with the violin on the far left? There we go. Classical music fan. Anybody know the guy on the right? There's a pin in the picture. He's drawing. It's MC Escher. And I'm showing these guys because what do we always say? When you see somebody who's incredibly successful, and I thought about putting like Elon Musk and anybody that you typically look at and say, there's somebody who's doing it right. There's somebody who's really good. Well, the thing is, what do we always say about those people? They make it look so easy. Well, what I've been thinking a lot about is the idea that maybe there's something else to that, right? Maybe there's something else to this idea that these experts, these people who are really succeeding in their field, because when we say they make it look easy, right, where the assumption is they're making it look easy, but it's not. What they're doing is incredibly hard, incredibly difficult, but now they're kind of rubbing it in our faces because they're making it look like it's easy. But I have a theory about this, that maybe the reason they're so good at what they do is because they found a way to make it easy. And maybe the way we should be thinking about improving ourselves and improving our lives, whether it's in your golf game or whether it's in learning an instrument or whatever in your life you want to improve on. Maybe we need to stop putting the emphasis on just working harder and running the drills, and maybe we need to start thinking about, how do I do this? I know what it's supposed to look like. How do I do this where it feels easy and where it feels natural, right? When I'm on that boat, I'm doing the exact same task that the captain's doing on the other side of the boat. We're just tying that line to the block. I'm doing it using every muscle in my body with so much stress and so much strain. He's over here just kind of whipping it around and then just locking it in place like it's nothing. He's found a way to make it easy. And I don't think we put enough emphasis on that. When you try to learn an instrument, and I have learned many instruments in my life. I've gotten into art. I love learning things. And the most common denominator I have ever found to improving quickly at something is that you have to eliminate unneeded strain. When I learned guitar, the biggest thing that would keep me from making progress is I would be like learning a solo or something like that, and I would realize all of a sudden that I had this tension just running through my entire arm. I wanted to get it right so bad that I just had this tension I was holding. And it wasn't until I released that tension that all of a sudden I could do what I was trying to do. So it really is crucial. But the idea is that when you anticipate something will be hard, you unconsciously tense. Your body tenses, and not only for your physical body, but when you run a company, if you're anticipating everything's going to be hard, you put in this mindset. And when you start managing a team, you'll really start to feel this, because you'll start spreading that poison. You'll start spreading the stress and spreading the strain that this is going to be really hard. You can't have any mistakes. Everything has to be perfect. And in reality, no, it doesn't. And you're probably putting a lot of time and a lot of effort into things that are not actually getting you the benefit. If I believe it will be difficult, I will discover that it is. We need to change our mindset about trying new things. We need to go in with confidence that we can find how to make it easy. So the rest of this, basically, I want to kind of give you a few tools. And this is really taken from my personal life, thinking about some of these people who have come through and done these things successfully. The idea of being in the zone, the idea of visualization, audiation, and imagination, the idea that when an athlete's out there doing it, right, they're not thinking about, meticulously analyzing every step of what they're taking. They are visualizing their objective, and their body is just fulfilling it. In singing, it's actually called audiation. Same thing with playing violin. You hear the note in your head and you play it. It is not a matter of mechanically. People talk a lot about muscle memory. It's not a matter of physically, mechanically knowing exactly where on the thing, visually seeing it and saying, I'm going to put my finger there, I'm going to put my finger there. You imagine it and you do it. The thing we need to be working on is improving our imagination, improving the accuracy of the imagination, being able to see it in our minds and achieve it. And the idea is you have this work at active rest. What we need to be putting more emphasis on is how to take out work from our life, if that makes sense. I mentioned the Zen of Screaming because I used to play music with the lead singer of Under Oath. And I asked him, because he would do this kind of style of singing that I really admired, where he could scream and it just sounded crazy on their records. And he pointed me to this DVD called the Zen of Screaming. And the idea was that they make it look like it looks like it's hard, and it looks like they're straining their voice and tearing up their vocal cords. But in reality, it's actually taking almost no muscle at all. That's how they can do it night after night and not lose their voice. They have learned to do that with active rest. Couple quick things here. Drawling with the Right Side of the Brain is a phenomenal book. I'm going to leave it at that for you to go and try this book out. But basically, it's unlike any drawing tutorial book you've ever seen, because it's not a matter of sort of telling you to draw this line and then draw that line and kind of a step-by-step paint-by-numbers thing. It's only a book about changing your perspective. It tells you to stop thinking about faces in terms of shapes and start thinking about just drawing what you see. And so here's some of the before and after pictures of people who just changed their perspective, who just took some of the stress out of what they were trying to do. And this is in the course of 3 weeks. All they did was change their perspective. So I'm speaking from experience here. It's a little embarrassing, but so this was my first attempt and my second attempt. And again, this isn't, I'm not trying to show off my drawing skills. This is basically just to say that I didn't have to sit and work for 10,000 hours to become an expert drawer. I just got there by changing my perspective. So one more, and all of these are on that site right there. If you are into this, there's a ton of them on there to see. It's just amazing the transformation some of these people were able to make. And so here's the idea. This is another great example. So Johns Hopkins did a study where they took jazz musicians, some of the most phenomenal jazz musicians who can improvise at the drop of a hat, created this special keyboard that didn't have any metal in it, put them in an MRI machine, and just told them to improvise, just told them to go for it. And they did these controlled tests to see what would happen in the brain, because they were assuming that while they were improvising, it just must be like a light show in there, right? It's got to be so busy doing all these things to make that music happen and be that phenomenal at it. What they found, however, was that it actually shut off a lot of the brain. In particular, a part of the frontal cortex that's involved with self-inhibition. So all of a sudden, these jazz musicians would just stop policing themselves. And all of a sudden, they were able to make this beautiful music out of instinct and out of a place of not trying so hard and just letting it flow. Again, letting their imagination lead that. I'm going to wrap it up here. But so the idea that I want you to take away from this is that you're probably trying too hard. And a lot of that comes from trying to be something you're not. The whole idea of imposter syndrome is that you think you have to be someone else to be successful. And I can almost guarantee you that a lot of you in this room have other people you think you need to be more like them. You think to be successful, you need to be like Elon Musk. You think to be successful, you need to be more like Steve Jobs. But in reality, that's not the case. So be yourself. There's a great book called The Charisma Myth by Olivia Fox-Cabane. And one more thing I'll leave you with is improv. So Keegan-Michael Key and other improvers have studied this as well, and I read a great book called Improv for Storytellers, where one of the main takeaways from it, to be a successful improver, stop trying to be clever. Just be obvious. Because when you're not trying to be clever, all of a sudden it's more relatable, it's more connectable. Because what happens is your obvious isn't my obvious. And so if you can get comfortable being yourself, having your own unique voice, and not trying to be someone else, all of a sudden you'll find you have a lot more energy, you have a lot more to give. And so my encouragement to you is to work hard to make it easy. I think if you do this, and if you find that you can reduce the grit in your life, you'll have more grit to spare for the right assumptions. So get out there, start your companies. I'm happy to talk to everybody after this. Thank you for letting me be with you.
Another round of applause for Scott. That was fantastic.